And now on Radio 4, a Georgian Trilogy by James Hopkin. 3 stories that were specially commissioned. They begin with the story of one of Georgia's greatest artists. A Peacock in Sulphur is read by Alan Corduna.
He could break an ankle for his industry walking these streets. Though his long stride takes him over potholes and puddles alike, he cannot help but repeatedly scuff his worn leather shoes. This part of Tbilisi by the train station is all tumbling rooftops and guttering, as hunchbacked shacks rear out of ash and mud and dust. Dank alleyways merge and separate like veins in search of a heart. It's as if the whole district is crawling down the hill towards the river. Occasionally, this tall, elegant, slightly stooping man sees a flower, even a small tree growing from a drain or through a crack in a wall, and this eruption of colour, of struggling life, lifts him to thoughts of work. So he stops to sniff or stroke or sketch. Does he imagine vines growing over these crumbling facades? Does he think of his childhood home, Mirzani, in the winemaking region of Kakheti? Though the Caucasus, these great mountains beset with snow and cloud and legend, run all the way round his country, he wonders if he will ever get back to his village at the eastern end of these peaks. Besides, whom does he have to go back to? He came to Tbilisi an orphan. Yet he walks tirelessly the city's twisting alleys and lanes, as if every step is a getting to know, a handshake from the heel. "I'll find a lonely place for home," his soul might whisper, as he strides past hovels held together by stray planks of wood. With his little case of brushes and paints in one hand, he often stops to marvel at the buckles and wares of Armenian peddlers, Kurdish fortune-tellers, Ossetian priests, or once he's in the better districts, at the glass panels of elaborate doors, or the flourish of a Persian balcony. Niko Pirosmani, Nikala, or the Count, as his friends call him when drinking in the dukhans, those shadow-drenched cellars fortified by smoke and strong spirits, and frequented by storytellers and card sharps, and all manner of moustaches and beards. Yes, they call him the Count, because of his implacable pride, his quiet and considered movements — he seldom speaks — his noble bearing, and because of his suit, cut in the European style, which goes rather nicely with his well-trimmed beard. And as for his black fedora, in this city of the yarmulke and the fez, the burqa and the small round Georgian svanery, yes, Niko's floppy hat sets him apart from the many religions thriving here. What's more, beneath the brim, his dark, melancholy eyes forever seek the furtive detail. "Don't paint yourself out, Nikala," says his friend the coffin-maker, each time he gives the artist more supplies of black paint. "Don't paint yourself out like a night with no stars." But Niko doesn't paint himself out. Not yet. He distills his wonder in solitude. He stretches out pieces of oilcloth on which to begin. He must be careful to fasten the edges, or the sheet will billow like the Black Sea at Batumi in early spring. Then he flicks the latch of his case and unwraps his bristles from a rag. He might be in a restaurant or dukhan, painting a fresh mural or a sign to hang above the door. He will be paid in khachapuri cheese bread, meat and wine, or chacha, a clear Georgian grappa of a lethal variety. He will paint a supra, a traditional feast. Yes, painted by a man whose stomach is empty. See, for example, his feast of 5 noblemen, a white cloth to render the table sacred, and upon which there is fish and boiled chicken and jugs of wine. Alongside there are tender pieces of shashlik and the long arms of bread cooked on the inside walls of an oven that looks like a well. Each element in the picture is carefully weighted and positioned, from the curve of the nobleman's boots to the droop of the dead slugs poised above their lips. The represented food is simple and enticing, the hungry painter again. He uses only 3 or 4 bold colours. He's fond of red, and remember, he has all that black. Yet the silence of the painting is overwhelming. A Georgian feast resonates to fierce toasts of friendship, and there's laughter, shouting, and often the polyphonic singing of men. But Pirosmani's noblemen are silent, even stupefied, mute beneath their moustaches. And it makes you wonder, is this the painter's silence, the silence of a soul forlorn, as day after day he sits alone and observes, not taking part in the feast, but finding what is most striking about a form, then making it plump with familiarity and seasoned with fairy tale? Yes, always alone, his fingers trembling in need of a brush, a shot of cha-cha, or maybe, most of all, the touch of a human being. Yet loneliness is desire urging you in the wrong direction, away from people and into the quarantine of pride. 2 or 3 years earlier, he had come close to marriage. Very close. In fact, only minutes away. There had been no courtship. It was to be a traditional arranged marriage. The ceremony began with a barrel organ and pipes and the lone dancing of the bride. Then an abundance of bread and meat, plus the best Kakheti wines. But before long, Niko rose from his table feeling rigid and breathless in his knee-length white chokra, the Georgian national costume. He walked away, and kept walking. When questioned angrily the next day by the family of the rejected bride, Niko answered simply, "I have to go to the mountains to paint." And so he did. He painted the professions, janitors, chefs, threshers at work. He painted firewood sellers, camel drivers, milkmaids. He painted Sosso the labourer, organ grinders, fishermen, railwaymen and guards. He was fascinated by the stench and grind of the city and by everyone who struggled to make a living there. After all, Tbilisi was such a contrast to Mirzani, where, as a child, he would look from the family's wooden house on the hill over the forest to the plains of Azerbaijan. Back then, every time Niko saw a tree, he knew he was a painter. Animals, too, the smell of sour milk and straw, and all this he took to his solitary life, to the wood and tin and manure of the poorest district of Tbilisi. Niko's animals have human eyes, said his detractors of his paintings. In fact, they have his eyes. They look right through you, but they see everything, everything. I tell you, his animals are self-portraits. This might be true. His animals exude an extraordinary tenderness. See, for example, a bear, moonlit night. This small creature is lone, solemn, and luminous, like Niko himself at night stalking the streets of the city, lantern in hand, his illuminated face as plaintive as a Russian icon. As it turned out, it was one of his animal pictures that at last brought Niko recognition. 2 Georgian brothers, poets and artists of the futurist movement that was sweeping across Europe at the time, were dining in an upmarket dukhan in the city when one of them noticed a painting of a giraffe hanging on the opposite wall. A blue giraffe with grey spots. It's magical. The only neck he ever painted was on that giraffe. His detractors would later mock, his people never have necks. But the giraffe has such grace and resolution and almost tearful eyes that the colourful incongruity does not matter. In Niko's hands, it became a mythical creature. A few days later, the brothers found the artist painting a shop sign. They invited him to join the newly formed Georgian Academy of Art, and immediately began to buy up his works. Though astonished and grateful for the attention and the small additional income, Niko was nursing other enchantments. One evening, he attended a performance by a French singer at the El Dorado Café Chantant. Though her movements bore all the clumsiness of provincial repertoire, for Niko, the singer Margarita embodied the glamour and sophistication of Europe. With her long hair and pleated skirt, she seemed to float around the stage. The painter's spirit filled with silence and longing, but also with despair, for he knew that however deeply attracted he was to this woman, he would not speak to her. Hadn't he already renounced the possibility of love? Besides, there was a stage between them, and a language too, if not an entire continent. And so he drank, knowing full well that the next morning his beard would feel rough in his hands, his eyes would feel sore in his head, and his brushes would lie stiff in their rags. But later, for every word he had not spoken to Margarita, he would find a brushstroke, a feigned caress, and he would recover her form. Without a neck, of course, her arms straight, but with a single open palm of entreaty, and in her left hand a bouquet, looking more like a bird's nest stuffed with blossom. 3 yellow birds fly about her head, her face distinctly Georgian, as the artist surrenders to the world between them. Struck out of time, luminous with promise, she is now always with him, though 2 tree stumps behind her suggest abandonment, a place where lovers could have sat, but never did. Thus Niko paints himself back from desire to a sad self-sufficiency. At the Society of Georgian Painters in Tbilisi, they were debating the value of Pirosmani's work. Some saw his paintings as wild and childlike, others praised him as a modern artist making a contribution to world art. Little did they know that he would soon be rehabilitated as Georgia's national painter, and Picasso would make a sketch of him at work. Niko attended one of the Society's meetings. "What we need, brothers," he said softly, "in the middle of our town is a big wooden house with a big table and a samovar. There we shall drink tea and talk about art." The dandies and academics, steeped in the new modernity, were stunned by his simplicity, though many of them tried to sketch his kind and noble face, and those black eyes that had many times rolled the length of loneliness. Yet matters took a turn for the worse, when an affiliated newspaper ran a cruel cartoon at Niko's expense. The artist's great pride could not accommodate such betrayal. He broke off all ties and went back to the streets of the poor district, where even the sunlight is jaded. He slept in dukhans reeking of stale beer, or on the unscrubbed floors of basements near the Malakan Bazaar, or in a cubbyhole under a staircase, with not enough straw for a horse. He was still painting, but losing strength, and quickly. Work would keep him on his feet, walking too, though he had become terribly stooped, buckled by solitude, shoulders drawn in as if comforting himself. But when he sat slumped in a tavern to drink, he became sick with a longing that could not be relieved. In his feebleness he could not even remember her name, only her eyes, perhaps the nape of her neck, the way she danced and filled him with light. Some time after, the Count was no longer upright, but gutter-weary and grey, his European suit long since worn to rags. A few times he tried to rouse himself from his cubbyhole, spurred by the light through the cracks in the door. But these embers soon faded. He became feverish. He couldn't stop shivering. He coughed up the last of his colours. Sometimes he felt himself to be an injured bird sinking into the hot sulphuric springs beneath the city. He saw animals, too, lions especially. "What brings you to my lair?" he struggled to ask. Yet his body provided little more than faint warmth for a rat. On the first day of Easter 1918, Niko Pirosmani's spirit left him and sped back to the vineyards and meadows of Mirzani, the humble village beneath the Caucasus Mountains where this fairy tale began, and will begin again. "Don't paint yourself out, Nikala," his friend had often said. "Don't paint yourself out like a night with no stars."
A Peacock in Sulphur was read by Alan Corduna. The producer was Rosalind Ward, and it was a Sweet Talk production for BBC Radio 4.
Right now, here on BBC Radio 4, the second story from A Georgian Trilogy by James Hopkin. The Wurst Express from Kakheti finds a young Georgian staying in Berlin at a momentous time in his country's recent history.
Blümchen is coming, says Vilmar one morning as I'm rolling up my mattress. He stands above me, sweating, breathless. He's a big man, like the professor in Der Blaue Engel. He's very kind to let me stay here in his flat. Each night I sleep by the window overlooking the courtyard. As I lie between dust and smoke, for Vilmar always has a cigarette on the go, I hear bottles being dropped in the bottle bank. So this is what they mean by the chimes of Berlin. And I hear the magpies in the solitary tree, their strangled call like barely muted machine gun fire. But the birds beside me are silent. As soon as I drop the blanket over their cage, the two canaries instantly forget to chirp. "Schnell! Schnell! Blümchen is coming!" Vilmar repeats, with a stamp of the foot that sets glasses chattering in the cupboard of an adjoining room. Next thing I know, the jogging pants, sleeveless padded jacket and shark teeth bracelets of Blümchen appear in the kitchen. A bio-farmer and hippie from the sticks, he's turned up in his rattling car with a boot full of Wurst and other delights. "Fleisch!" exclaims Vilmar, spitting out the last crumbs of his morning feed, his eyes widening, and then again, "Fleisch!" Blümchen has also brought bio-wine, apples, bananas, cheese, and dozens of jars of meat pastes and fruit preserves. For a moment, it feels like home. Home? For me, that's Kakheti, a beautiful region of eastern Georgia where we produce the finest Georgian wines, palate-stinging cheeses, the most succulent cucumbers and tomatoes, not to mention potatoes, as well as woolen blankets beneath which you will dream of Jason and the Argonauts, if not of Queen Tamar. And of course, we have the mountains, the Caucasus, or Caucasioni, as we say. Vilmar is dribbling over the jars while hanging up 2 or 3 hoops of Wurst on special hooks under the shelves, like a butcher's shop. Then he selects certain pots and bottles and chunks of meat, which he then packs into the bags. "Today, Soso," he announces, placing a hand on my shoulder, "you will be the Wurst Express." After a strong coffee and Blümchen's departure, Vilmar explains what he means. "All this," he says, waving an arm at the bags of bottles and pots while munching on the end of a stick of meat, "is for the poor artists who sleep in their ateliers in Wedding. You will take it to them, okay? One stop U-Bahn, one stop S-Bahn. Simple." It seems that Vilmar is the philanthropist of Moabit, one of the poor districts of this city. Why else would he look after someone's canaries, or provide a sleeping space for a 38-year-old Georgian poet here on a 3-month visa? And why else feed these impoverished artists? Yes, he has a Georgian soul, which means we are a poor people, but what we have we share. Still pushing the thick Wurst into his mouth and trying to talk at the same time, thus showering me in sausage sparks, Vilmar explains, "Here, Dieter. Here, Jürgen. Here, Klaus." And he draws a rough map with crosses along the same street. He explains that these artists are part of a bigger group from the east who defected to West Berlin before '89. "Some were caught," he says, "put in custody or in mental hospitals. Furchtbar!" He spits. "Terrible. They have no money. Okay?" I readily agree. How could I not? I already feel an affinity with these people. My country suffered 70 years of communism, and the Russians have been coming over the mountains since 1801. You could say we're an embattled people. Outside the station at Wedding, I see an Iraqi with an artificial leg and a begging bowl. As I walk, my arms stretching under the weight of all the meat and wine, and with beads of sweat running down my nose and dropping onto my lips, I have a sudden flash of a painting by Niko Pirosmani. In Kakhetian train, a steam engine is pulling 4 carriages on a moonlit night beneath the lower Caucasus. There's a warmth to the whole picture, as if the flames stoking the engine also light up the carriages behind. The foreground is littered with wine barrels and hogskins. Yes, in Georgia we kept wine in the skins of wild pigs, which are then laid on their backs, trotted in the air, as if they'd had a drop too much themselves. It's a fairy tale painting. The train doesn't really need its tracks. And as I imagine this train, I realize what Vilma meant. I am the Wurst Express. The Wurst Express from Kakheti. I find the block of atelier, Eingang 4. Just as I'm about to enter, a head with scraggly white hair and glasses pops out from a top-floor window and shouts, "Guten Tag, ich bin hier!" I take the industrial lift up to the top, where the artist, Dieter, greets me warmly and beckons me inside his studio. He's tall, about 70 years old, with a drinker's belly and kind brown eyes, magnified slightly by the lens of his spectacles. He's prepared coffee and sandwiches. I give him the bags, and I joke that it's a pocket feast, a Georgian table delivered by hand. He laughs and embraces me again. "Didi madloba," he says in Georgian. "Thank you very much." He explains he once had an exhibition in Tbilisi. Though there is a radio on in the background, we talk for some time, and he shows me his paintings. His pictures are poetic, like Pirosmani's, but bolder, in a big city way, but with that same teasing blend of humour and melancholy. With sadness in his eyes, Dieter tells me how, as a child, he hid in a cellar during the Allied bombing of his home city, Dresden. He tells me of his defection from the East and the difficulties of being a painter without much of a market. It's my turn. I tell him of my family and of my past as a shepherd with my dog Pachara, driving horses and cattle and sheep to Kakheti along the perilous mountain pass that's often soaked in mist. As we climb alongside rushing rivers and waterfalls made of fish bones, the Chama Valley opens slowly before us. And I tell Dieter how well I sleep when I am back in Kakheti, as if I'm lying down not on my bones, but alongside them. And I tell him that during the long summer dusks, on evenings when the moon is not pouring its pale enchantment down every ravine, I often sit on the wooden balcony and watch the mountains turn from stone to wood to velvet, with every changing shade, before darkness finally ushers them into anonymity. And I wonder to myself, what is all the fuss in the world in the face of nature's beauty? Whereas in Berlin, I say, my lungs are the used bags of a vacuum cleaner. Dieter likes this. He laughs his belly up and down. Suddenly, the radio chimes the hour and the news comes on. And I cannot believe what I hear. Surely I must have misheard, or mistranslated, but no, there it is again. Russia has invaded my country. Yes, Russia has invaded the Georgian provinces of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and gone further. I look at Dieter, who's looking back at me. I don't know what to do. I rush to the open window, inadvertently kicking over a bottle of soaking brushes, sending dirty water all over the floor. Stumbling to the window ledge and leaning out, I shout, "I love Georgia!" And then once again, thumping my chest, "I love Georgia!" Dieter totters over alongside me, his white curls brushing the side of my face. "Russia out of Georgia!" he shouts. And then the two of us together, as he puts his arm round my shoulder. "Russia out of Georgia!" Our voices echo in the empty courtyard. I must get back to the flat, check the internet, speak to my family, email friends, find out what's going on. Dieter embraces me, and I run back to the S-Bahn. Hours later, Vilmar finds me slumped in front of the computer, smoking his cigarettes. The canaries are chirping frantically. Vilmar has heard the news. "Come," he says. "A beer." I take a plastic cola bottle of Chacha, Georgian grappa, with me. My mother brews it back in Kakheti. My stomach turns when I think of the Russians attacking my people. I must get back. We meet two of Vilmar's friends. We drink a lot of cold beer. There are many long silences. People keep patting my back and shaking their heads. We toast peace, and then friendship, and then Russia out of Georgia. Finally, we get up to leave. Vilmar waddles drunkenly across the street. Back in the flat, I unroll the mattress and throw the blanket over the canaries. I smoke 2 more cigarettes and feel sick. Then come the magpies in the courtyard with their machine gun fire. They go on until the small hours here. I look to the tree. I wish it was a Kakhetian wishing tree, and then I could wish that this invasion was merely make-believe. I can't sleep. There are too many thoughts in my head, each one of them tugging at another, and all of them ending in fear. On the internet, I discover a Ukrainian website with photographs of Georgian soldiers mutilated by the Russians, or by the murderous wild militia in their wake. I call Vilmar. He looks at one photograph, says, "Furchtbar," and then rushes away. 2 hours later, I'm choking on my tears. An email tells me that one of my friends, a soldier, has been killed. I can't get home. There's no way back. The Russians have closed the borders and the airports. Suddenly I'm captive here. A refugee. My head is spinning. I don't know what will happen to my country. Maybe it will be wiped off the face of the earth. Maybe I will never see it again. I stagger to the mattress and throw myself down. But the magpies are still screaming gunfire. So I yank the blanket from the birdcage, and immediately the canaries start to sing.
The Wurst Express from Kakheti was written by James Hopkin and read by Tom Goodman-Hill. It was produced by Rosalind Ward and was a Sweet Talk production for BBC Radio 4. Next week you can hear the final part of a Georgian trilogy when an English journalist is trapped on the border with Russia.
Now on BBC Radio 4, The Soul is Missing Fairy Tales, the final story in our series A Georgian Trilogy by James Hopkin. An English journalist is travelling around Georgia with a group of European writers and artists, but his travel plans are about to be interrupted.
We had been descending like an autumn leaf in a gentle breeze, a lazy side to side as we lullabied our way down the mountain. A 600-metre descent to the next plateau, 18 hairpin bends, with darkness rushing over every precipice, leaping every gully in pursuit of our bronchitic bus, which skidded in ice and scree when approaching another sharp turn, coughed, spluttered, came close to the edge, offering us journalists and artists on board an aspect of the abyss below, if not of our souls, for those with their eyes closed, or our stomachs, for those with their ears open. Yes, our heads had been nodding in reverie during our gentle, if perilous, transit, for we just enjoyed yet another impromptu Georgian feast. In a white-walled cafe, with 2 tables and a mirror, the police chief of Kazbegi had seen us off with honeypots filled with homemade wine, while the waitress brought us plate after plate of khinkali, pasta sacks shaped like little money bags and containing tender pieces of lamb. So there we were, on the bus. English journalists and Italian poets, German painters and Georgian writers, filled with the same meat and wine, the same images of beauty, the same visions of friendship and goodwill. But as we entered a concrete anti-avalanche tunnel, the mood was abruptly curtailed by the violent shuddering of the bus. The engine stopped. We sputtered a few meters to a halt. Our bodies carried on shuddering where the chassis had left off. After all, we were on the infamous military highway from Vladikavkaz to Tbilisi, just 9 days after the Russians had finally left most, but not all, parts of Georgia. We were coming back from Kazbegi, from 2 glorious days in this village beneath the imperious Mount Kazbek, silver-peaked, just as Pushkin noted. How many legs do these clouds have? I'd wondered, as I walked the main track through the village. Count them. For, sure enough, there were cows and clouds coming down the street towards me. Both chased stray dogs, or nuzzled at trees and verges, or stood by tin shacks and abandoned vehicles, a wet nose on a window pane. Even the monument to the 19th century novelist Alexander Kazbegi was wreathed in cloud, thus awarding him his poet's laurels and granting his long beard an extra flourish. He was a shepherd as well as a writer, explained Soso, our Georgian host, with evident pride, for he too is both a shepherd and a poet. Yes, at over 3,000 metres, this village does not experience weather. It inhabits weather, lying as it does in a valley surrounded by the peaks of the Greater Caucasus, which look like giant eagles, wings interlocked, standing with their backs to all observers. The views range from breathtaking to biblical, as alpine meadows stretch this way and that. Some slopes are wrapped in grasses singed by a season of sun, others are covered in autumnal forest, a shock of yellow leaves against a blue sky, and the snow-clotted ravines beyond. Up there, before this vision of the 5,047-metre Mount Kazbek to which Prometheus was said to have been chained, it felt like I was standing at the place where the world had begun. All creation. Even in autumn, the colours, the contours, the scale. Such a landscape cannot fit in a poet's notebook. How Soso and I traded metaphors and laughed at their inadequacy, or in a photographer's lens, though everyone was snapping away. Perhaps only a painter can begin to suggest, oh, Pirosmani. But no, what you really want to do is embrace the scene in its entirety, to roll in the pastures, giggling, head in daisies and dreams and myths of your own making, or to leap and sing along the river Tergi and suddenly find yourself speaking a language you will never be able to read, or to run with the horses across the plains beyond the 14th century Gegeri Trinity Church, and keep running until you run into someone you haven't seen for a lifetime, or perhaps have never seen before. Surely God is from here, one of our party remarked. Unfortunately, replied Soso, I think he probably is. Back on the bus, darkness and fog were closing in. The headlights of each passing vehicle illuminated the fear and sobriety growing on our faces. And they were strange, these vehicles, rickety farm wagons, rusty tankers, a military jeep. Some of them had blacked-out windows. Others slowed down to take a good look at us. In turn, we scrutinized them. We made jokes, increasingly nervous, increasingly unfunny jokes. We were only 20 kilometers from the Russian border. We feared helicopters appearing over the darkening ridges. Meltwater dripped on the roof and registered loudly the passing of time, the coming of night, the fading of our humours. I recalled our eerie flight into Tbilisi across the Black Sea in the small hours, looking down at the scarce lights, wondering if we were flying over Russian-controlled zones. Another hour passed. Soso had driven ahead in his jeep in the search for diesel. Fog plugged up both ends of the tunnel. Anxious artists paced up and down the aisle, muttering in their own language, for while most emotions can be translated, Distress needs its mother tongue. Vilmar, with whom Soso had been staying in Berlin, kept calm by chomping away on a sausage-sized stick of walnut paste, a Georgian speciality that pings your taste buds the moment you open your mouth. Alongside him slept a German doctor whom we nicknamed Dr. Valium. Following the conflict, he hadn't wanted to go ahead with the trip, but having been persuaded, he realised he could only do so under heavy sedation. "Is everything okay?" I'd ask him now and then. He would rouse himself, his eyes turning to me slowly behind small round spectacles, and he'd answer, "Everything's fine, very fine. Why shouldn't it be?" Meanwhile, the Georgian driver, Sura, smoked or went for a walk along the freezing road ahead, as if, as they say in Georgia, we were making an elephant out of a fly. How happy we'd all been only the night before. Another feast. Yes, every night in Georgia promises a feast. We were in a 2-building settlement beneath Kazbegi, and I'd gone outside for a moment and wondered about the brief but ancient respite between the heaven of this landscape of friendship and love and the hell of poverty, of war, of invasion. And in this moment I felt, what? Happiness. Yes, in the midst of all this beauty and poverty and struggling, that's what it was, happiness. For the kindness of these people knows no bounds. They will share with you whatever they have. Soso, who'd lost 2 friends in the conflict, was laughing one night when he'd invited us to his parents' home on the fertile plains of Kakheti. "Don't pick up the plates and offer them round. Take," he insisted. "Take with your hands. Whatever is on a Georgian table is there for the taking." I stood and toasted Soso's family, and I recited a line by Galacticon Tabidze, a 20th century Georgian poet, from his poem On the Road. "The soul is missing fairy tales." As the Tamada, the master of the toasts, Soso thanked me, adding, "These days, perhaps it is the fairy tales that are in need of souls." Back on the bus, our driver's mobile rang. The unanimous cry went up, "Soso!" But it was not good news. "They are out of diesel here too," he reported. He would have to go on to Tbilisi. A night on the mountain, is that what we were facing? It was getting so cold. We had no more food and very little water. What if the Russians came back this very night? All the Georgians I'd spoken to in Tbilisi had expressed fears of their imminent return. Our mutterings became mantras, became prayers. We were a European assembly of sitting ducks before the gates of Asia. "Everything's fine," said Dr. Valium, probably woken by the phone. "Very fine. Why shouldn't it be?" But no one was convinced. Some took out bottles of schnapps. Others switched on reading lights and showed photographs, the Ikalto and Alvaverde monasteries in Kakheti, and Michketa, the former capital of Kartli. Some took comfort in icons of St. George or St. Nino, who brought Christianity to this land in the 4th century. Our prayers became promises of devotion. Searching for a vision of calm, I thought of a priest I'd met in a small 11th century church in Kakheti, where the walls carry extraordinary murals and the black streaks left by oil lamps. Tall, thin, veiled in black robes and a long black beard, the priest moved with infinite grace, every limb speaking of patience and humility. Together we'd lit candles and planted them in the narrow sandboxes. We prayed for the refugees. Only a few days earlier, I had visited these Georgian people displaced from the destroyed villages bordering South Ossetia. They were sleeping in Tbilisi, in brightly painted kindergartens or in grubby old university buildings. Their stories were the same. Russian shelling, followed by the marauding wild militia. I spoke to an 81-year-old man who'd had all his teeth knocked out with the butt end of a Kalashnikov, and I spoke to a young woman who, having hid in the woods for weeks, made good her escape by car, only to discover the road had been mined. As she looked in the rearview mirror, the car of friends behind her was blown up. Just as I was wondering if we, too, were now refugees, captives of the Caucasus, I was startled by a car honking alongside. Several of us rushed to the front. The police chief from Kazbegi, a container in each hand. He'd apparently been knocking on the doors of neighbouring villages, asking for contributions. Never has the dark stench of diesel been so welcome. Our prayers answered, the bus once again in dreamy descent, I recalled one of the highlights of the trip. It had been another fine autumn day when we drove out of Tbilisi through the packed suburbs of Sunday markets and car auctions, along country roads of horses and dog carts, scooters pulling small wagons, and myriad other motors made of spare parts, old parts, odd parts, and driven by men with long white beards. And these rattling contraptions heaved or pushed hay and apples and onions up and down a road lined with stalls, tended by grandmothers in headscarves and shawls. We were going to Mitsani, the birthplace of Pirosmani. Even the Soviet-built museum dedicated to the artist, a hideous chunk of concrete atop a grassy hillock, could not detract from yet another awe-inspiring vista over forested slopes to the plains of Azerbaijan. Inside the museum it was cold and dark. There hasn't been electricity for years, since the old Soviet generator broke down. Like pilgrims we shuffled round, one by one, candle in hand, to stand in front of each painting. Many of his best works were there, such as Threshing Floor at Dusk, Woman with Easter Eggs, Still Life with a Loaf of Sugar, as well as Picasso's sketch of the artist at work. Later we stumbled into the late afternoon sunshine that seemed to have flooded the village. A man was beckoning us. He was all smiles and big palms. On the bonnet of his car, a larder, he had laid out cheese and bread and apples, and there were bottles of beer and wine and chacha. His 3 daughters were with him. The family name? Could it be so? A grandnephew of the painter himself? Pirosmani. So we sat on tree stumps, drinking undistilled yellow chacha outside the wooden shack where the painter had been born, and we toasted the generations of his family. And then we raised our plastic beakers to peace.
The Soul is Missing Fairy Tales was written by James Hopkin and read by Ben Miles. It was produced by Rosalind Ward and was a Sweet Talk production for BBC Radio 4.